Hey folks, it's Agathys. Got another tier list video for you guys. In this one, we will be ranking every first level spell in Baldur's Gate 3 on a tier list. This is part of a series I am doing where I'm ranking every spell in the game level by level. If you haven't watched my cantrip tier list, at least watch the intro of that video I recommend, because in the intro I talk about what each of these tiers means while I am ranking spells. I don't want to redo what each tier means for every video we're going to make, so you can go back to the cantrips one if you want that, but you could probably piece it together. There is a meaning for each of these tiers, so there's kind of a system for my rankings. Anyways, there's a lot of spells to cover in first level. This is the most spells in a single level. So let's just dive right in, starting with Animal Friendship. I want to try to pull up some of these spells while I describe what they do, because in my cantrip video I made some mistakes, and I feel kind of bad about that. So I thought I could just go from memory, but it turns out even after 1,000+ hours of playing and analyzing this game, you still end up forgetting some things. Animal Friendship. This is a single target CC effect. You can only target an animal with an intelligence of 3 or less. They make a wisdom saving throw. If they fail their saving throw, they become charmed, which means they cannot attack the spellcaster. And they also have advantage, or the spellcaster has advantage on charisma checks and dialogue. This is such a useless spell, guys. So I'm putting it into RP tier for sure. Charm just isn't a good condition as an effect in combat, right? So a charmed creature won't attack the spellcaster, but they'll still attack everyone else in your party. So yeah, it's just not good. And there's a saving throw to resist. If this was a guaranteed, I might start thinking about it, but it's just charmed is just not good. So yeah, let's not waste any more time talking about it. Next up is Armor of Agathys, which is going into S tier easily. This one's interesting, so I might take a second to explain it. This is a single target defensive buff you can only cast on yourself. It is a Warlock exclusive. No, it's not Warlock exclusive. Warlocks can get it, and a certain Draconic Bloodline Sorcerer can get it. I think it's White Ancestry. And then, of course, Bards can get any of these spells. But Armor of Agathys, when you cast it on yourself, you will gain 5 temporary hit points shield, which lasts until your next long rest, or until you've taken the 5 damage, right? Moreover, an enemy that attacks you with a melee attack and damages that temporary hit point shield that you have will take 5 cold damage in retaliation. That is how it works as a first level spell. For each spell level that you upcast it after first, you're going to gain 5 temporary hit points more added to the shield, and an additional 5 cold damage dealt on the retaliation procs. And what makes the spell so good is the way that it scales as you upcast it. So just real quick, imagine it casts as a level 1 spell. You got that 5 temporary hit points, 5 cold damage retaliation. Even at levels 1 to 2, a lot of enemies that attack you will average more than 5 damage per hit. So likely, the Armor of Agathys cast is going to tank 1 hit, so it'll tank 5 hit points worth of damage. It'll get 1 proc of the retaliation for 5 cold damage, for a total of 10 hit point swing in terms of damage mitigated and damage dealt. For a single action and level 1 spell slot, 10 hit points is not a lot. You really want to be getting more out of your spell cast than that, so it's not that good. But now let's look at it if you upcast it, even as just a second level spell. At second level, you're now getting 10 temporary hit points and 10 cold damage in retaliation. But at level 3, once you get second level spells, most enemies aren't actually going to be averaging more than 10 damage on a hit. So likely you can expect this to proc retaliation damage twice. So now for a second level spell slot, you can expect to mitigate 10 hit points worth of damage from the temporary hit points. But instead, you're now dealing 20 cold damage in retaliation from the 2 procs of 10, for a total of 30 hit points worth of damage dealt to mitigate it all added together. Much better. A jump from 10 to 30, that's 3 times the damage swing just from a single spell slot level upcast. And then you can see how the more and more you're upcasting it, the more and more value you're going to be getting from this. Because not only is the retaliation damage adding up, but you're just getting more procs of that retaliation damage. And then there is the fact that you can start stacking all kinds of defensive spells with Armor of Agathys to get even more value out of it. So in early access, the one that we always stacked with this was Blade Ward. The combination of Blade Ward and Armor of Agathys was absolutely insane in early access, because most melee attacks were doing physical damage, right? So now you're having physical damage, and you can think of that as doubling the value of your temporary hit points, but also doubling the amount of procs that you can expect from each cast of Armor of Agathys. So now upcast as a second level spell, instead of you expecting 2 procs of 10 damage, you can now expect 4 procs of 10 damage for 40 retaliation damage dealt. There's no attack roll on that. There's no saving throw to resist. It just procs. It's unavoidable for them unless they're attacking you with range attacks. It's absolutely insane. And remember, it's cold damage, so you can also double it against wet targets. It's actually a late game damage strategy on a level 1 spell. So yeah, it's really hard to beat that. Absolutely insane. But yeah, we've talked about it enough. Next up is Arms of Hadar. Arms of Hadar are going into C tier. When you cast this, it's an AoE damage spell, and it works in a burst AoE from you. So everyone within 3 meters of you, or 10 feet if you use feet, is going to have to make a strength saving throw. If they fail the saving throw, they take 2d6 necrotic damage, and for 1 turn, they're unable to use reactions. And of course, if they succeed on their save, it will deal half as much damage and they don't lose their reactions. Now, the damage on the spell is quite low. 7 damage isn't a lot of damage. Now, if you're hitting lots of targets with it, it can add up. But you guys know, if you watch my cantrip video, you guys know how I feel about small amounts of damage spread to lots of targets. Even though it adds up to a lot of damage, there's still just a tactical weakness to it, where the point of damage is to kill targets and cancel their turns as quickly as possible. And the most optimal way to do that is to focus down 1 target at a time so you're canceling their turns. Spreading out your damage very thin, even if it adds up to a lot, it's not helping you burst down targets as quickly as possible, or at least not as well as it could. So I'm very unimpressed by the damage. And then the fact that you have to run in to like melee range with your warlock to do this also is an unattractive option. So really, what this was for, especially in early access, was if enemies ever close a distance on you, you would cast it to cancel their reaction and run away before they can make attack of opportunity. But it's not even a guaranteed in that situation. They have to fail their saving throw for you to do that. So it just had no use. At early levels, it has no use. It's bad for damage. Canceling reactions really doesn't matter. If you want to escape, probably just use Misty Step or Expeditious Retreat or something like that, not Arms of Hadar. So in early access, I had it rated RP tier. However, I am bumping it up to C tier just for the fact that reactions are more valuable in the full release of the game, because enemies can use it to cast Counterspell. And if the wrong spell gets counterspelled, that can be a big problem. So technically, Arms of Hadar is the only AoE way to cancel multiple reactions, but that situation will probably never occur. The 2 targets that could cast counterspell have to be grouped up within 10 meters of each other. You have to run in there, they both have to fail their saving throw, and then you've done it. More than likely, one of them will just counterspell the spell. And they probably would have counterspelled that spell if it was something else too, like Hex. So, I mean, I think I'm being very generous putting Arms of Hadar into C tier. Honestly, it's just a spell that doesn't have a use. It's too varied. It does damage and like the cancel reactions, but if you want to deal damage, there are better spells for that. If you want to cancel reactions, there's better spells for that. Not worth using. Next up is Bane. I'm putting Bane into A tier. Bane is very interesting. We can just go to it now. Bane is like the debuff version of the spell Bless, which we're going to talk about next. What you do is you pick 3 enemy creatures within a pretty generous radius. I think it's 30 feet, 9 meters of you. Those targets must make a charisma saving throw. If they fail, they will be baned for the next 10 turns or for as long as you maintain concentration. A Bane target has a 1d4 penalty to every attack roll that they make and every saving throw that they make. And that's actually quite good. Usually enemies make a lot of attack rolls, so a 1d4 penalty on every one of those really adds up. That can mitigate a lot of damage. But the 1d4 penalty to their saving throws is probably better because it softens up those saving throws for the really debilitating spells we're going to talk about in this video and the ones after it. The problem with Bane is that it's taking your concentration slot, and every class that can cast it has a better use of their concentration slot. So the classes that can cast it are clerics. I think bards can cast it, and on bards it does kind of have a use. Let's actually look. Bards and clerics can cast it, and Oath of Vengeance Paladin can cast it, but only really bards are the ones that at first level, it's maybe the best option for their concentration slot. So all of this is to say that even though it's A tier, I seldom cast it because there's better spells to cast for that slot. Like, for example, Bless. Bless is one of the best first level spells in the game, easily. Let's go over it now. So Bless is just the ally buff version of Bane. You're picking 3 allies within a radius, and they all gain 1d4 bonus to their attack rolls and saving throws, but there's no saving throw to resist. You can't miss the spell. You're just getting the full effect of it on every ally. Every level that you upcast it, you get to pick an additional target. By the way, that was the same with Bane. So as a second level spell slot, you can hit yourself and every member of your party. Upcasting it past that is only if you want to buff your summons as well. But a 1d4 bonus to your attack rolls is fantastic for mitigating the malice that you get from Sharpshooter, Great Weapon Master. So very high value in terms of damage added to your composition with Bless. And then the 1d4 bonus to your saving throws can be very, very clutch. There aren't a lot of ways to boost saving throws. It's actually the defense that even late game, you cannot reliably resist attacks against it unless you have a Paladin casting Bless in your party. And a Paladin casting Bless, suddenly all of your saving throws are so high, you can reliably resist, late game effects. So yeah, it's really good. It's good at level 1 when you get it. It's good at level 12 in the last fight of the game. It's just a great spell. So that's Bless. Next up is Burning Hands. Burning Hands is going into B tier. The gist of Burning Hands is that it is AoE damage. And as I've said, I don't value AoE damage that high, but it's actually the best AoE damage for this level. And ultimately, decent AoE damage, like Arms of Hadar is just weak damage. Decent damage from Burning Hands is always at least average, right? It's a consistently average use of an action, so for that reason it's B tier. We can just go over the details now. Here we are, Burning Hands, so it deals, so it's a dexterity saving throw in a 17-foot or 5-meter cone. Every target, ally, enemy, doesn't matter, in that area must make a dexterity saving throw or take 3d6 fire damage, half as much if they succeed on the save. So 3d6 damage is averaging around a 10.5 against targets who fail their save. It's still not a lot, but it is one of the, like I said, it's one of the highest AoE damage spells you can get at this level, so that is B tier for me. Next up is Charm Person. Charm Person is identical to Animal Friendship, except it can hit persons rather than just animals. But it is equally as bad. I don't really want to say anything else about it. There's so many other spells to go through. So we're going to skip ahead now to Chromatic Orb, which is going into A tier. Chromatic Orb, we actually do need to look at it because it's several spells in one. So here we are, Chromatic Orb. Chromatic Orb is a single target spell attack. It uses your spell attack modifier. It can crit all of that. It's ranged, 18-meter range. And when it hits a target, it's going to deal 2d8 damage of a type of your choice, or potentially 3d8 damage if you choose Thunder. Thunder needs more because all it does is raw damage. All of these other types do the 2d8 damage plus an effect. So for example, if you pick Acid, it'll deal 2d8 acid damage and -2 armor class for 2 turns. So Acid is actually quite good. Cold will cause a little patch of ice on the ground that enemies can slip on. Lightning will charge water in the area. Poison will generate a cloud. It does the surface effects that Larian have added to the game. Now, the reason I like this is it's a very versatile attack spell. Versatile in the sense that you can easily bypass resistances by changing the elemental type, or picking an element to exploit weaknesses. Like, for example, when you have to do the wood fight, one of the pretty difficult fights early in the game, you've got this spell to deal fire damage, and the woads are vulnerable to fire damage. Awesome. So its versatility is great for that. And then some of the added effects are quite good, like the acid one is really good. And then it can deal cold and lightning damage. Single target cold and lightning damage is very good because you can double it against wet targets, which we'll talk about in a bit. A good single target spell is probably going into A tier. A good AoE spell is probably going into B tier. That's generally how I think about it. Next up is Color Spray. Color Spray is going into C tier. It's so close to actually being better, but not quite there. Anyways, let's look at the spell now. Color Spray. So this is one of two spells that functions in kind of a weird way, where instead of being a saving throw to resist, they actually target up to a certain amount of hit points. And I tend to like that. So how Color Spray works is in a pretty generous cone, 5 meters, 15 feet. Enemies in that area that you select up to 33 hit points worth will become blinded. No saving throw to resist. So, just as an example, let's say you're fighting 3 goblins, and each goblin has 11 hit points. They total 33. That means you can hit all 3, and they will be blinded with no saving throw to resist. But now let's say one of those goblins had 12 hit points instead of 11. Well, now they total over 33. So you could only hit 2 of them for 22 hit points worth. And those 2 will become blinded. So yeah, you get the idea. If you have enough targets that are low hit points, you can very, very reliable hit them with a CC. Now the CC effect on Color Spray is blind. A blinded target will have disadvantage on their attack rolls, and attack rolls against them will have advantage, which is pretty potent. It's not canceling turns, but it is a pretty severe debuff. This will last for 1 turn, and that is really the problem with Color Spray, is the duration of the blind is too low. If this was 2 turns, I could start seeing myself casting this, but as it is, I basically never do. To be thorough though, when you upcast it, you will be adding 11 hit points for each level that you upcast it. 1 turn of blind with no saving throw to resist can be good, but there's other ways to get a guaranteed blind in this game. I'll just say that. Even in this level, we're going to talk about other ways to get a guaranteed blind. I find it just loses out compared to other spells that do similar things, which we'll talk about in a bit. So especially when I get to sleep, I'll reference back to this and we'll talk more about why Color Spray is in C tier. But for now, let's keep going with Command. Oh yeah, Command's going into S tier. I'm so excited. I love this spell in this game. It used to be A tier for me in early access, but some ways it interacts with items in this game has bumped it up to an easy S tier for me. One of my favorite spells in the game, easily. So Command. Command is a single target crowd control spell. You're going to pick a target, and they will make a wisdom saving throw. If they succeed on the saving throw, nothing happens to them. So this is save or suck, but the effects of it, if they fail, are potent enough that it's worth gambling on. What are the effects? Well, it depends on what you pick. This is another spell that's several spells in one, because you're giving a command word, and the idea is that the enemy will obey the command if they fail their wisdom saving throw. Here are the commands you can give. First one is approach. When a target is command approach, they will spend their turn doing nothing but moving towards you. So it cancels their turn as far as action goes. And then they'll also move towards you, which might put them in a vulnerable position. And then finally, that movement will proc attacks of opportunity. So you can absolutely use this to trigger reaction attacks, weaponizing your reaction, especially early game. That can be extremely valuable. Next up is Command Drop, probably the best effect. Command Drop on a target, they will drop their weapon. So it only works on targets that are holding weapons. But when a target drops their weapon, you can just run over and pick it up for free. And the AI isn't good about working around sidearms. It basically doesn't do it. So landing a Command Drop against an enemy basically removes that enemy from the fight. I mean, they'll punch you and it'll do a little bit of damage, but not a lot. And so you can just ignore them. It's like an insta-kill effect. Not really, but close. And that's insanely good for a level 1 spell. Next up is Command Flee. Flee is the opposite of approach. The enemy will run away from you, and again, that will proc attacks of opportunity. These are the 3 best uses of it, but you can also get Grovel. With Grovel, the enemy will drop prone, and with Halt, the enemy will do nothing. He'll just completely stand still. So all of these are canceling turns, I think except Grovel, at the least, plus usually some added effect like the enemy will never have a weapon again, or you proccing attacks of opportunity. And then the other cool thing is that as you upcast this, for each spell slot above first, you can affect additional target. So by a late game, if you're casting it with, let's say, a 5th level spell slot, you're nailing 5 of these guys. If you hit 5 people with command drop, you've completely won the fight. Of course, it's a saving throw to resist. You might not hit them all, although you can if you stack up enough Arcane Acuity. I mean, seriously, it's a fight decider. Moreover, it's an enchantment spell. And with the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel, which you can get very early in Act 3, you can start casting enchantment spells on a bonus action. So you can spend your action stacking up Arcane Acuity, your bonus action upcasting this with a 5th level spell slot, everyone drops your weapons, and the fight is over on the first turn of combat. It's absolutely insane. Definitely Command is good when you get it, and it's good all the way until the very last fight of the game. S tier all the way. Next up is Compelled Duel. I'm putting Compelled Duel into B tier. Let's look at the spell now. So Compelled Duel is another single target CC effect. It requires your concentration, and it's a bonus action to cast. So what happens is on a bonus action, you cast this on a target. They will make a wisdom saving throw, and if they fail for the next 3 turns, or for as long as you maintain concentration, they will attack you. Technically, they have disadvantage if they want to attack other targets, but my experience with it, which is kind of limited, I don't cast it that much. But when I have cast it, they pretty much just attack the person who casts it. So it's a taunt effect, and taunt effects can be pretty good. Taunt effect on a bonus action is quite excellent. So yeah, it definitely has its uses, but it's a concentration slot, and there's better spells that you want to be using your concentration slot on for the class Agathys with his Paladin. I mean, the effect is good. Yeah, the effect is good. I could see it being A tier. The fact that it's single target, you can't get more targets if you don't upcast it. It's pretty limited. So I think B tier is a pretty comfortable place for Compelled Duel. Next up on our list is Create Water. Create Water is, I think, the best level 1 spell in Baldur's Gate 3. I'm going to come out and say it. I don't think anyone will argue with me on this one. So yeah, let's go over it now. So this is a spell with 2 effects. There's Create Water and Destroy Water. Create Water is the main one. When you create water, you're going to summon in a pretty small AoE, and actually at a pretty short range. Those are kind of the limiting factors of this spell. You summon water from the sky. The water falls down and creates a puddle on the ground, and everyone in that area when you summon it gains the wet condition. Now, making targets wet is just as good in Baldur's Gate 3 as it is in real life, because wet targets in BG3 are vulnerable to electric and cold damage, or lightning and cold damage, and resistant to fire damage. Now, vulnerability, a target that is vulnerable, takes double the damage of that damage type. So it's like a crit, but better, right? Because a crit will double the damage dice on an attack, not the flat modifiers. Vulnerability doubles everything. Everything gets doubled. So like a crit, but better. You're going to get 3 turns of wet from a cast of this spell on everyone in an AoE, and there's no saving throw to resist. No saving throw to resist. AoE forced vulnerability against 2 very common damage types in the game. It's absolutely insane. And there's even a defensive use of this where you can cast it on your own party if you're expecting a lot of fire damage and you're not at risk of any lightning and cold damage, to gain resistance to fire damage for 3 turns. I haven't done that a lot, but I have done it some. And that's just the Create Water part of it. The Destroy Water actually evaporates puddles from the ground, which isn't really useful, to be honest, but maybe there's a spot, I don't know. Maybe creative players can find a use for it. It doesn't matter, because Create Water, the Create Water part of it, is absolutely S tier. Best level 1 spell in the game. You will use this. It's like meta defining. You can make entire comps around Create Water, and they work from level 1 all the way to level 12. It's broken. Honestly, this should be a 3rd level spell. It would be an S tier 3rd level spell. The fact that it's first level is just wild. By the way, when you upcast this, the radius of the water effect will increase. Next up is Cure Wounds. Cure Wounds is going into RP tier. It's pretty much never worth casting for me because it's completely outcompeted by the other healing spell at this level, which is Healing Word. But we'll just go over it. Cure Wounds is melee range. You cast it on an ally. It takes an action to cast, and that ally will gain 1d8 hit points plus your spell casting modifier. Oh, by the way, every level you upcast it, it will increase by 1d8. In combat, heals are good when you're reviving a target when they've been downed and they're rolling death saving throws. The actual numerical value of a heal is not most of the value you get out of a heal when you're casting it in combat. So, yeah, it just gets outcompeted by Healing Word. We'll talk about that more when we get to Healing Word. For now, just trust me, RP tier. Next up is Disguise Self. Disguise Self is going into Psych. It's S tier. I know, guys. I'm shocked that this spell is actually kind of good and useful in the game now, and I feel like it shouldn't be. But anyways, let's just go over it. Disguise Self takes an action to cast. You can cast it on yourself to change your appearance into a different race that you can pick in character creation. So you can see here's the list of all the ones you can change into. Now, outside of combat, this is useful because with some meta knowledge, you can use it to get a better chance of passing a skill check, or sometimes just straight up bypassing skill checks. So, I mean, for example, like if you're trying to infiltrate the goblin camp early in the game and you're a drow, the goblins will recognize you as one of them. So if you're a halfling, you can disguise self to turn into a drow, and now you're having an easier time infiltrating the goblin camp. It works for stuff like that. But there is actually now a combat use of this, where you can change into one of the various races to get racial exclusive item bonuses. Mostly this is good for gnomes and Githyanki. I'd say Githyanki are the big one. There are all kinds of items in this game that give special boosts specifically to Githyanki. But for some reason, at least this is how it was back a few patches ago. I haven't tested it recently, but as far as I know, this hasn't changed. If you disguise self and change into a Githyanki, you will get all of those benefits. So I can play as a halfling, disguise self myself into a Githyanki, and suddenly I'm getting all the sick Githyanki gear on my halfling on top of the insane lucky halfling ability. So yeah, that's Disguise Self. It's actually good. It's concentration free. It lasts until your next long rest. And it actually is spell slot free too, because you can now cast this as a ritual. So for the cost of nothing, you can get any racial exclusive item boost in the entire game. I feel like that belongs in S tier. Sorry, if you hear a munching sound in the background, that is my guinea pig. She's eating so loud, and it's really annoying to me. But she's really having a good time, and I don't want to interrupt her. Next up is Dissonant Whispers. I'm putting Dissonant Whispers into A tier. It is a single target damage and crowd control spell. It's going to deal psychic damage and frighten a target. We'll just look at it now. Okay, here we are, Dissonant Whispers. So you cast this on a target within 18 meters or 60 feet. They must make a wisdom saving throw. If they fail the saving throw, they will take 3d6 psychic damage, so that is an average of 10.5, I believe. And they will become frightened for 2 turns. The frightened condition, enemies who are frightened have disadvantage on all ability checks and attack rolls, and I believe they also cannot move. Yes, they can't move as well. So it's a decent crowd control effect, especially if you combine it with prone. It basically works like a stun. Of course, if they make their saving throw, they will take half of 3d6 psychic damage. That is Dissonant Whispers. It's also an enchantment spell, so late game you can cast it on a bonus action. I mean, it's giving you kind of alright single target damage and a kind of alright crowd control effect. Yeah, it's good. I would probably put it in B tier, except for the fact that you can start bonus action casting it late game. By the way, when you upcast it, it adds 1d6 psychic damage, which isn't a lot. That's not really good scaling. Yeah, I'd say low end of A tier for Dissonant Whispers. Next up is Divine Favor. I'm also putting Divine Favor in the low end of A tier. So let's look at the spell. Divine Favor is a paladin spell, and also I believe War Domain clerics get it. Yes, that's correct. It says so down here. It is a self buff that lasts for 3 turns or for as long as you maintain concentration. During this time, your attacks will deal an additional 1d4 radiant damage. Now, especially by mid-game when you're making multiple attacks with your paladin, this adds up to quite a bit of extra damage as far as efficiency on the spell slot is concerned. By the way, it's a bonus action to cast, so you're not losing an action to cast it. The only thing that makes this not really worth casting is the fact that it takes concentration, and on pretty much every cleric and paladin, you're going to be using your concentration on at least Bless, right? That said, I do find it worth casting as a very early use of the Radiating Orb breastplate that you can get very early in the game. Paladins with Divine Favor can actually start stacking up that Radiating Orb on multiple targets really well, really early. And just getting radiant damage on your attacks in combination with the Radiating Orb equipment is, in theory, quite good. So for that reason, I think it deserves at least an 8 tier. Next up on our list is Ensnaring Strike. I'm putting Ensnaring Strike into C tier. Yeah, I think that's a fine place for it. So Ensnaring Strike, along with one other ability, Hail of Thorns, which we'll talk about later, are kind of the Ranger's version of a Smite spell. And if they work like Smites, I would like them much better, but they work similar but not identical. It's a spell exclusive to Rangers, and I think maybe Oath of Ancients Paladin. So how it works is, it takes your action and a bonus action, and it's going to augment an attack, right? So you're going to make a weapon attack when you cast the spell, and it's going to deal damage like normal with your weapon attack. And then that target's also going to make a strength saving throw. If they fail their strength saving throw, they become ensnared. An ensnared target cannot move, and they will also take 1d6 piercing damage at the beginning of each of their turns. So it has like a sustained damage effect, but it does require concentration to keep up that ensnared effect, and they're going to get to re-roll the saving throw on each of their turns as well. The way this is not like a Smite spell is it actually replaces your attack rather than augments an attack. So once you have extra attack, Ensnaring Strike is never worth casting, because you're always going to get more damage out of extra attack, and you're not spending a level 1 spell slot to do it. Also, even in early game, there are better uses of a Ranger's concentration slot. I mean, Hunter's Mark, which we'll talk about in a bit. So Ensnaring Strike's pretty much never worth casting. It's just not that useful, to be honest. So it's going into C tier for me. Next up is Entangle. I think I'm going to put Entangle in the low end of B tier. It's very similar to Ensnaring Strike. We'll go over it now. So it's a Druid spell. Yeah, I think it's a Druid exclusive spell. What happens is, within a range of 18 meters, and an AoE of 3 meters or 10 feet, which is a very small AoE, I just want to point out. It's not very much. You're going to summon Entangling Vines. Everyone in that area must immediately make a strength saving throw, and if they fail, they become ensnared. It brings their movement down to 0, and I believe also attacks against them have advantage. They will get to re-roll that strength saving throw at the beginning of each of their turns. The area persists on the ground, so you can shove people into it, or if people move into it, they have to make a saving throw. And what else? Oh yes, if it comes in contact with fire, it will ignite, and all creatures in the area will get the burning condition for 2 turns, which deals a little bit of extra damage. I think it's 1d4 fire damage per turn. Not that much. So you can ignite it for a little bit of extra damage, but as a crowd control effect, it's not that potent of an effect, right? Movement goes down to 0. You have an advantage on attack rolls against them, but they get to re-roll it every turn. It's not that potent, and the AoE on it is so low. It's just really not that good as a crowd control effect. There are better crowd control effects, but I feel like we can put it consistently average as like a zoning ability. I almost never cast it, but technically it's not bad, right? It's average, so that's B tier for me. And that brings us to Expeditious Retreat. Expeditious Retreat is going into B tier as well. Let's look at it now. This is a spell you can cast on a bonus action on yourself. And when you cast it, for as long as you maintain concentration or until your next long rest, you can then dash as a bonus action. Also, when you cast it, it functions like a dash. So you can dash immediately, and then for every round, for as long as you maintain concentration, you can dash on a bonus action. So it basically gives you like the rogue's ability to dash on a bonus action, right? And that can be pretty good even for casters, especially if you want to utilize certain dash effects that you can get through items, like the Speedy Light Feed, I believe they're called, which gives you lightning charges when you dash. It can be quite good for that. The fact that it's so cheap on an action economy is what puts it in B tier for me. I mean, the actual effect probably is not worth your concentration slot. However, it's just a bonus action to cast. So, yeah, B tier for Expeditious Retreat. I'm not sure what else to say about it. Next up is Faerie Fire. I'm putting Faerie Fire into A tier. I think it probably belongs right around there for now. Faerie Fire is one of the better offensive-oriented debuff effects that you can get with a first-level spell slot. Let's look at it now. So, at a range of 18 meters, it doesn't say the AoE, but it's a very generous AoE, in my experience. In a very wide AoE circle, all enemies must make a dexterity saving throw. If they fail, they become illuminated with this Faerie Fire condition for the next 10 turns. While they have it, they're illuminated, they cannot turn invisible, and attacks against them have advantage. So this is the much better version of Entangle for me, because it's getting that all attacks against them have advantage, but it just lasts for 10 turns or as long as you maintain concentration. They don't get a saving throw to resist it at the beginning of each of their turns. So it's really quite good for that. Also, revealing invisible targets, no saving throw to reveal invisible targets, and then they can't go invisible again if they fail, is very, very clutch. There's some fights in this game, even early game, that's extremely useful for. So altogether, it's a good, reliable crowd control effect and a wide AoE that also has this like anti-invisibility feature to it. Very good, A tier for sure. Next up on our list is False Life. False Life goes into C tier. The spell is so underwhelming. False Life is a self buff that takes an action to cast. When you cast it, you gain 7 temporary hit points. For every spell level that you upcast it, you're going to gain an additional 5. It's just not a lot of hit points, guys. It's not enough hit points for the spell slots that you spend on it. The only way that this is not RP tier is that late game with the Staff of Cherished Necromancy, you can start upcasting this with a 6th level spell slot, basically action economy free. And then it starts being good because you can actually gain like a lot of value. You cast this on every ally, and you actually get a lot of value out of it. But it's so late in the game, and by then, it's not that good an effect. Like, it's a lot of hit points, but you have so many overpowered effects that late in the game that I think C tier is a comfortable place for it. Next up is Featherfall. Featherfall is going into low end of C tier. Honestly, probably deserves RP tier, but I don't want to rule out that there is a situation where you might use this. But after my many, many runs, I've never used this in a fight. And I can't think of a time where I've taken damage and I thought, wow, I really wish I'd cast Featherfall there. It's just usually not taking, in my opinion. But let's go over the spell. So here's Featherfall. It's a bonus action to cast in Baldur's Gate 3 rather than the reaction that it is in Tabletop 5e. It's an AoE buff that affects all your allies in an AoE, and everyone affected will gain immunity to fall damage for the next 10 turns. It doesn't require concentration, and you can actually cast it as a ritual outside of combat. And there are some puzzles in the game where Featherfall solves them, so it can be good for that, but I find that there are easier ways to solve them without Featherfall. So it's not even that important outside of combat. Fall damage sounds very daunting, but I find that most fights where you don't want to get shoved, you're not worried about fall damage, you're worried about damage from other things. Some of them can be a straight up insta-kill effect, like fights in the Shadowfell, fights in the Ethereal Plane. the last fight, some of the last fights of the game where you're fighting in the sky. Whenever you get shoved, you're getting shoved off the map, and it counts as an instant death effect. It doesn't matter that you're immune to fall damage. Even early game, you're scared of things like lava more than you're scared of fall damage. There is some areas where you can take fall damage, but it's not a big enough of a problem that you're using up a spell learn slot, and you're using up a whole spell slot to cast it with a bonus action. That's just never happening in my runs, but I want to leave it open to the idea that it could happen by putting this in C tier. Next up is Find Familiar. I'm sorry guys, I'm copping out on this one. I'm just putting Find Familiar in C tier. I was hyped on this spell in early access, but it just doesn't scale well. I find it's just extremely tedious. People have been getting pretty mad in some of the comments of my videos about how I overlook summoning comps. I don't feel like I overlook summoning comps, although I do not play them that often, because I just don't like the way they're done in Baldur's Gate 3 for the most part, but they can be very good comps, if niche comps. But, I mean, Find Familiar is just not the backbone of even a summoning comp. It's just kind of there for flavor. Technically, it has some combat value, so I'm leaving it out of RP tier. If you want to know what all the familiars are and what they do, I cover all of that in the spell tier list on my website. For now, we're just going to move past it and go to Fog Cloud, which is going into S tier. Fog Cloud's honestly so good that I kind of soft ban it. I don't actually ban casting it, but there's a strategy that you can do with Fog Cloud that I personally ban in my own runs. So let's look over the spell now. So Fog Cloud summons a cloud in a radius. It's a 5 meter or 15 foot radius, and it stays up for 10 turns, I believe. Yes. It stays up for 10 turns, or for as long as you maintain concentration, so this is taking your concentration slot. That cloud counts as heavily obscured anyone who is in it, and also anyone who is in it, allies and enemies alike, becomes blinded with no saving throw to resist. So this is actually a way to get blind with no saving throw. I told you there would be when we covered Color Spray. This is what I was thinking of, was Fog Cloud. The problem is, if you're using it to blind enemies, they will probably just walk out of it. So you have to combine this with some other crowd control effect that stops them from moving. So maybe ensnared, maybe maimed, maybe frightened, maybe prone, maybe the Sentinel ability on one of your frontline fighters, stuff like that. But in combination with those, it is good because blind is a pretty good debuff. No saving throw to resist. That is good well into late game. I mean, we're talking some of the boss fights you could be using this on, as long as you find ways to keep people stationary. So it's good for that, and that is the use I actually do use it for. However, the kind of soft banned use is if you cast this on yourself and just use it as a cloud for heavily obscurement. There are some items in this game that get a bunch of boosts if you're obscured. So Fog Cloud is the cheapest way, spell slot wise, to get that obscurement in every fight. But it also breaks vision, which means any enemy or any unit in your party who can hide on a bonus action can dip in and out of the Fog Cloud, hide on their bonus action, and completely avoid aggro. So take a rogue, for example. What you can do is step out of the cloud on your turn, shoot someone with your action, move back into the cloud, bonus action to hide. Now nobody can see you, because even when they step into the cloud, they're blinded. So you've completely avoided cones of vision. You're immune to aggro, effectively. So for as long as Fog Cloud's up, if your whole team is able to hide, you completely avoid aggro forever. So theoretically, you can just use this to never take any damage for your entire run. And that's too good for me. That's why I ban it. Now, the AI might be fixed around this. I'm going off a lot of this information from early access, but my understanding is it kind of isn't. Enemies won't really run into the Fog Cloud or cast spells into the AoE spells into the Fog Cloud. It's not really happening for the AI. So, yeah. Regardless, just as a saving throw free blind, it deserves S tier for me. Fog Cloud is insane. This video is so long I split it into two. This is the end of part 1. I'll have part 2 out shortly, and when I do, I'll put a link in the corner here and in the description. Talk to you soon.